March 15, 1974. Frank Morrison had been president of the Bakersfield Hells Angels for 8 years, king of his corner of California. That's exactly why he picked the wrong man to humiliate that Saturday night. The stranger walked into Morrison's roadhouse alone, soft voice, gentle eyes. Frank saw weakness. He shoved the man, called him names that would haunt him for 3 decades, made his crew laugh. Then someone in the crowd whispered 2 words that froze every soul in that bar. Muhammad Ali. What happened in the next 10 minutes changed everything Frank Morrison thought he knew about strength. The footage disappeared, the witnesses scattered, and for 30 years, Frank carried the weight of a moment when the greatest fighter who ever lived showed him what real courage looked like. The night Frank Morrison learned the difference between being feared and being respected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a held breath. Frank Morrison felt his chest tighten as every eye in the roadhouse turned toward the man he'd just shoved against the bar. The stranger Ali straightened, slowly, brushing dust from his jacket with movements so calm they seemed choreographed. "Muhammad Ali," the whisper came again, rippling through the crowd like wildfire. Frank's crew, the Bakersfield Hells Angels who'd been laughing seconds before, now stood frozen. Patches and leather meant nothing when you were staring at a legend. Frank's hands trembled. The man he'd called names, pushed around like some nobody off the street, was the heavyweight champion of the world. The man who'd faced down Sonny Liston, who'd refused the draft and lost everything, who'd beaten Foreman in Zaire just months ago. Ali turned those gentle eyes on Frank. No anger, no threat, just disappointment. "You done?" Ali asked, his voice still soft, still carrying that slight rasp that made reporters lean in close. "Because I just wanted a drink, brother." Brother. The word hit Frank like a physical blow. This man, this giant among men, had just called him brother after being humiliated in front of a room full of bikers. Frank's mouth opened, but no sound came. Behind Ali, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A tourist with a camera, still rolling. The red recording light blinked like a demon's eye, capturing every second of Frank Morrison's shame. "Turn that off!" Frank barked at the tourist, a thin man in pressed khakis who looked like he'd wandered into the wrong decade. "I'm just documenting my trip through—" "Turn it off!" Frank's roar echoed through the bar, but the damage was done. Minutes of footage. Him pushing Ali, the crowd's recognition, his own face twisted with the kind of hate that would look uglier with each passing year. Ali placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. The champion's fingers were gentle, but Frank could feel the power in them. These were hands that had dropped giants. "Easy now," Ali said. "Man's just making memories." Frank shrugged away from the touch, his pride screaming even as his soul begged him to shut up, to apologize, to be human. Instead, he did what bullies do when cornered. He doubled down. "I don't care who you are," Frank snarled, though his voice cracked like a teenager's. "This is my place, my rules." The lie tasted bitter. It was everyone's place now. Ali owned the room simply by being in it. Tommy Wrench Kozlov, Frank's sergeant-at-arms, stepped forward. Tommy had been with the club since the beginning, had watched Frank earn his patch through blood and brotherhood. Now Tommy's face carried a disgust Frank had never seen before. "Frank!" Tommy's voice held a warning. "Stop!" But Frank couldn't stop. Pride was a poison, and he'd been drinking it for 8 years as chapter president. He jabbed a finger at Ali's chest. "You think because you can dance around a ring you can come into my—" Ali caught Frank's finger. Not rough, not painful, just stopped it, like holding back a child's tantrum. "Son," Ali said, and somehow that word carried more authority than any threat Frank had ever made. "You're hurting, I can see it, but hurting me ain't gonna heal whatever's eating at you." The bar held its breath. In the corner, the tourists kept filming. Frank felt something break inside him then. The facade he'd built, the fear-based respect he'd cultivated, the image of himself as king of this small kingdom. It all cracked like old leather. Frank started, and for a moment he almost found the words, almost apologized to this man who'd shown him more grace in 5 minutes than Frank had shown anyone in years. Almost. Instead, he pulled his hand free and stepped back, his face burning with shame he couldn't acknowledge. "Just get your drink and get out," Frank muttered. Ali nodded slowly, ordered a Coca-Cola from the trembling bartender, left money on the bar, more money than the drink cost, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "Frank Morrison," he said, somehow knowing Frank's name though they'd never met. "When you're ready to talk like men instead of fighting like boys, you know where to find me." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of bikers who just watched their president get schooled in dignity by the greatest fighter who ever lived. The tourist packed up his camera. Frank's crew wouldn't meet his eyes. And in the distance, Frank Morrison heard the sound of his own legend dying. What he didn't know was that the real reckoning was still 30 years away. The night was just getting started, and Frank Morrison was about to learn that some kinds of shame never wash off. The door swung shut behind Muhammad Ali with a soft whisper, but the silence that followed roared louder than any Harley engine Frank had ever gunned. He stood there, sweat cooling on his neck despite the bar's stuffy air, watching the space where Ali had been like a man staring at his own grave. The tourist, that pale vulture with his camera, fumbled with his equipment, stealing glances at Frank like he knew he'd captured something worth more than vacation memories. Frank's throat constricted. 30 seconds of film, that's all it would take to destroy everything he'd built. "Tommy!" Frank's voice came out rougher than gravel. "Handle that." Tommy Kozlov hadn't moved from where he'd tried to stop Frank's verbal assault. The sergeant-at-arms stood frozen, his thick arms hanging at his sides, disgust still etched across his weathered face. For 8 years, Tommy had been Frank's right hand, had backed every play, every decision. Now he looked at Frank like he was staring at a stranger. "Handle what, Frank?" Tommy's Boston accent carried an edge Frank had never heard directed at him. "You want me to beat up some tourist for filming you acting like a piece of shit?" The words hit harder than any punch. Frank's chest tightened, that familiar rage building, the same fury that had gotten him into this mess. But underneath it, crawling like a parasite, was something worse, the knowledge that Tommy was right. He disrespected the club. The lie felt hollow even as Frank spoke it. "No." Tommy stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his intensity. "You disrespected the club. You disrespected yourself. And you sure as hell disrespected that man." Around them, the other members of the Bakersfield charter shifted uncomfortably. Bobby Chainsaw Williams nursed his beer like it held the answers to life's mysteries. Mickey Torino studied the floor with sudden fascination. These men had followed Frank through bar fights and territory wars, had trusted him to lead with honor. Now they couldn't meet his eyes. Frank's hands trembled as he reached for his whiskey. The glass felt foreign, too light, like everything familiar was slipping away. "You forget who's wearing the president's patch, right now?" Tommy shook his head slowly. "I'm wondering if the wrong man's wearing it." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Frank knocked back his drink, the burn doing nothing to wash away the taste of his own shame. In 8 years as president, he'd never had his authority challenged. Not like this. Not with the quiet disappointment he saw reflected in every face around him. The bar's jukebox kicked back to life some Merle Haggard tune about being on the wrong side of everything. How perfectly fucking appropriate. Frank watched the tourist gather his camera gear with shaking hands, probably still processing that he'd just filmed Muhammad Ali getting hassled by a small-time biker in a nothing bar in Bakersfield. "Where you staying?" Frank called to the tourist, his president's voice commanding attention even in defeat. The thin man looked up, frightened. The Motel 6 on Union Avenue." Frank nodded slowly. Information was power, and right now he felt powerless. "That film doesn't leave this town. We understand each other?" The tourist bobbed his head like a dashboard dog, clutching his camera bag to his chest. "Of course, Mr. Morrison, of course." But Frank saw the lie in the man's eyes, saw the calculation. This wasn't some random vacation footage anymore. This was history. The night Muhammad Ali walked into a biker bar and showed a room full of outlaws what real strength looked like. As the tourist scurried toward the exit, Frank caught his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. 41 years old, salt and pepper beard, eyes that had seen too much violence and not enough grace. When had he become the villain in his own story? "Frank." Tommy's voice was softer now, almost gentle. You got a choice to make here. Frank met his old friend's eyes in the mirror. Yeah? What's that? You can let this eat you alive, or you can learn from it. Tommy placed a heavy hand on Frank's shoulder. That man didn't come in here looking for trouble. He came looking for a drink and maybe a little human kindness. And what'd he get? Frank's jaw worked silently. Outside, he could hear Harleys firing up in the parking lot. His crew was leaving, not dramatically, not in protest, just leaving, like men who'd lost respect for their leader and didn't know how to say it. He knew my name, Frank said quietly, still staring at his reflection. How'd he know my name? Tommy squeezed his shoulder once, then let go. Maybe the same way we all knew his. Some reputations travel further than others. The sergeant-at-arms walked toward the door, pausing only to drop a 20 on the bar. Lock up when you're done feeling sorry for yourself, he said without turning around. And Frank, figure out who you want to be tomorrow. Because tonight ain't gonna wash off easy. Then Frank Morrison was alone with his shame, his whiskey, and the ghost of Muhammad Ali's grace. Frank sat in that suffocating silence for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. The whiskey had gone warm in his glass, and the ice cubes had melted into amber pools that reminded him of tears he'd never shed. Outside, the last Harley had rumbled into the distance, taking with it the only family he'd known for 2 decades. He was reaching for the bottle when the payphone behind the bar started ringing. The sound cut through the quiet like a buzzsaw, sharp and insistent. Frank stared at the black rotary phone mounted on the wall next to the cash register. Nobody called the bar this late except other members, and they'd all just left. The phone kept ringing, each shrill note driving deeper into his skull. On the 7th ring, Frank hauled himself off his stool and walked behind the bar. His legs felt unsteady not from the whiskey, but from something deeper, like the ground itself had shifted beneath his feet. Morrison's, he growled into the receiver. Static crackled on the line. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years pierced through the distance like a blade. Frankie? Jesus Christ, Frankie, is that really you? Frank's blood turned to ice water. The voice belonged to Danny Snake Torino, Mickey's older brother and former enforcer for the Oakland Charter. Snake had been there that night in '71 when Frank earned his president's patch, had been there when Frank married Sandra, had been there for everything that mattered in the old days. Snake had also been dead for 3 years, killed in a prison riot in Folsom. Who is this? Frank's voice came out as a whisper, a laugh bitter and familiar. Come on, brother. You know who this is. Question is, do you know what you just did? Frank's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. This had to be someone playing games. Had to be. But the voice... Christ, it sounded exactly like Snake down to the slight lisp from the scar that split his upper lip. Danny's dead, Frank said, more to himself than to whoever was on the line. Yeah, well, apparently being dead gives you perspective on what really matters. The voice paused, and Frank could hear breathing on the other end steady, patient, like a predator waiting for prey to bolt. You remember what you used to say about respect, Frankie? How it was the only currency that mattered? Frank did remember. He'd said those words the night he took over as president, with Snake and Tommy and all the brothers standing around him in a circle of leather and loyalty. Well, you just spent yours, the voice continued, all of it, in front of the greatest fighter who ever lived, and some tourist with a camera who's probably already called the networks. That film isn't going anywhere, Frank said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was wishful thinking. You sure about that? Because word travels fast when Muhammad Ali gets disrespected by some small-town outlaw who doesn't know when to shut his mouth. The voice dropped to a whisper. You know what's going to happen when that footage gets out? When the world sees Frank Bulldog Morrison president of the Bakersfield, Hell's Angels pushing around a black man who just wanted a Coke? Frank's vision blurred at the edges. The bar seemed to tilt, like the whole building was listing to one side. This is 1974, Frankie, not 1954. The world's watching now, cameras everywhere. And you just gave them a perfect example of everything they hate about us. The phone line crackled with static, and for a moment Frank thought the connection had died. Then the voice came back, softer now, almost gentle, the way Snake used to talk when he was about to deliver really bad news. The club's going to cut you loose, brother. They have to. Oakland's already heard about tonight through the grapevine, and they're not happy. You think they want the heat that's coming? You think they want federal attention because one of their presidents can't control his mouth? Frank's legs gave out. He slumped against the wall, the phone cord stretched taut. Everything he'd built, everything he'd bled for, crashing down because he couldn't swallow his pride for 5 minutes. You've got maybe 24 hours before they come for your patch, the voice said. Maybe less. Use the time to figure out your next move. And Frankie? That man you just humiliated, he tried to show you grace. He called you brother. You might want to think about what that means. The line went dead with a soft click that sounded like a coffin closing. Frank stood there holding the receiver until the dial tone became unbearable, then hung up with trembling hands. The bar felt different now, not like his kingdom, but like a tomb. Everything familiar had become foreign. Everything solid had turned to sand. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, each drop like a countdown to the end of the only life Frank Morrison had ever known. Snake's dead, he told himself again. 3 years dead. But the voice, Christ, every inflection had been perfect. The slight rasp from chain-smoking Marlboro Reds, the way Danny used to say brother like it was both a blessing and a warning. Frank had been to the funeral, had watched them lower the casket into California soil while Sandra gripped his arm and whispered about how young they were all dying. Frank pushed himself away from the wall and walked back to his stool, but he couldn't sit. Energy crackled through his body like electricity before a storm. 24 hours. Maybe less. He'd heard those words before, whispered in back rooms when patches got stripped, when brothers became strangers overnight. The front door's glass rattled in its frame, and Frank spun toward the sound like a gun had gone off. Just the wind, just the storm picking up. But his heart hammered against his ribs anyway, and he realized he was scanning the parking lot through rain-streaked windows like he expected to see headlights, like he expected them to come tonight. Handle it, he told himself. Fix it. Frank grabbed the phone book from under the register and flipped through the yellow pages until he found what he was looking for. Motels. His finger traced down the listings until he hit Motel 6 on Union Avenue. He dialed the number and waited through 4 rings before a bored night clerk answered. Yeah, Motel 6. I need to speak to one of your guests, Frank said, forcing his voice to stay level. Thin guy, checked in tonight probably. Had a camera with him. Sir, I can't. This is Frank Morrison. I own Morrison's Roadhouse downtown. Frank let some of his old authority creep into his tone. This man filmed something at my establishment tonight without permission. I just need to talk to him about getting the footage back. A pause. Frank could hear the clerk thinking, probably weighing policy against the possibility of trouble. Room 237, the voice said finally. But if he complains... Frank hung up and was halfway to the door before logic caught up with him. What was he going to do? Drive over there in the rain and beat up some tourist? Confirm every stereotype that footage would already suggest? He could see it now. The headlines, the news reports. Biker gang leader threatens witness to Ali assault. He stopped with his hand on the door handle, rain pelting the glass inches from his face. His reflection stared back, distorted and ghostly. When had he become the kind of man who solved problems with intimidation? When had fear become his first language? The answer came unbidden. The day you put on that patch and decided respect meant making people afraid of you. Frank turned away from the door and walked to the bar's ancient jukebox instead. The machine hummed quietly in the corner, its colored lights cycling through reds and blues and golds like a carnival ride nobody was operating. He fed it a quarter and punched B7 without looking. Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison blues filled the empty space, all train whistles and regret. I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. Perfect. Even the jukebox was mocking him tonight. He was walking back toward the bar when the phone rang again. Frank froze. The sound cut through Johnny Cash's voice like a scream, sharp and demanding. He stared at the phone, counting rings. 3, 4, 5. Each one felt like a hammer blow against his chest. On the 6th ring he answered. Morrison's silence, then breathing slow, measured, like someone taking time to choose their words carefully. Frank Morrison? The voice was different this time. Younger, professional. Not Snake, not anyone from the old days. Depends who's asking. My name is David Caldwell. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles. I understand there was an incident at your establishment tonight involving Muhammad Ali? Frank's mouth went dry. The tourist hadn't wasted any time. Probably called from his motel room the second he got back, selling his footage to the highest bidder. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Morrison, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm working on a project about Mr. Ali's impact on American culture. If you'd be willing to speak with me. Frank slammed the receiver down so hard the bell inside rang like a death knell. The jukebox played on. Johnny Cash singing about paying for sins in a place where time moved like molasses. Frank reached for his whiskey with shaking hands, but even before the glass touched his lips, he knew the alcohol wouldn't touch what was eating him alive. Outside, lightning split the sky, and for just a moment the parking lot lit up bright as day. Empty, still empty. But they were coming. Hashtag Chapter 5, Middle Development. Frank stood with the dead phone in his hand, watching lightning illuminate his empty parking lot in stark, accusatory flashes. The filmmaker's professional tone echoed in his skull. Mr. Morrison, I'm not here to cause trouble. But Frank knew better. Trouble was the only thing left now. He set the receiver down with deliberate care this time, afraid that if he slammed it again, something inside him might shatter completely. The whiskey sat untouched on the bar, amber liquid reflecting the jukebox lights like a pool of liquid fire. Johnny Cash had moved on to Ring of Fire, and the irony wasn't lost on Frank. He was burning down and everyone could see the flames. The front door rattled again, harder this time. Frank's head snapped toward the sound, and through the rain-streaked glass, he saw headlights cutting through the storm. Not the scattered beams of passing traffic, but the deliberate approach of someone who knew exactly where they were going. 4 hours, maybe less. The headlights died, and Frank heard the distinctive rumble of a Harley shutting down. Then another, then a third. His blood turned to ice. They weren't supposed to come tonight. The voice on the phone had given him time. The door opened with a sharp chime of the entry bell, and Tommy Kozlov walked in, water streaming from his leather jacket. Behind him came Bobby Williams and Mickey Torino, their faces grim as pallbearers. They moved with the quiet purpose of men conducting unpleasant business. "Thought you all went home," Frank said, but his voice cracked on the last word. Tommy shook his head slowly. "Got a call 20 minutes ago. Oakland wants a meeting." "When?" "Now." The word hit Frank like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the bar, feeling the room tilt around him. Not tomorrow. Not in a few hours to gather his thoughts and figure out damage control. Now. "Who called?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer would make everything worse. Sonny Barger himself. Tommy's Boston accent made the name sound like a death sentence. Said there's already footage making the rounds. Said the club can't afford to look weak, especially not with federal heat building on all the charters. Frank's legs went weak. Sonny Barger didn't make personal calls unless the situation was beyond salvaging. The founding father of the Oakland Charter, the man who'd built the Hells Angels into a nationwide brotherhood, was now personally involved in Frank's destruction. "The footage is out?" The words came out as a whisper. Bobby Williams spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with something that might have been sympathy. Tourist made some calls before he even got back to his motel. Turns out he's got connections to some news people in Los Angeles. They're calling it The Night Muhammad Ali Met Real American Prejudice. The jukebox seemed to grow louder, Johnny Cash's voice now sounding like a eulogy. Frank reached for his whiskey and knocked it back in one burning swallow, but the alcohol only made the edges of his vision blur. Everything he'd built, 8 years as president, 15 years in the club, a reputation that opened doors and commanded respect from Bakersfield to San Francisco, dissolving like sugar in rain. "There's something else," Mickey said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man delivering news he didn't want to share. "My brother Danny. Someone's been using his name. Making calls, stirring things up." Frank's blood froze. "What do you mean?" "Danny's been dead 3 years, but tonight someone called the Oakland clubhouse claiming to be him. Said he had information about what happened here. Said Frank Morrison was losing control, becoming a liability." Mickey's eyes were haunted. "Sonny thinks someone's playing games, trying to destabilize the charter from the inside." The room spun around Frank like a carnival ride breaking apart. The mysterious phone call, the voice that had sounded exactly like Snake, the warning about 24 hours. Someone had orchestrated this entire nightmare. But who and why? Frank. Tommy's voice cut through the chaos in his head. We need to go. Now. Sonny's waiting at the Oakland clubhouse and he doesn't like to wait. Frank looked around his bar, the kingdom he'd built from nothing, where his word had been law and his respect unquestioned. In a few hours it would still be here, but he might not. Patches got pulled for less than what he'd done tonight, and when you lost your colors in the Hells Angels, you didn't just lose a membership, you lost everything. Give me 5 minutes, Frank said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Tommy nodded and walked toward the door with Bobby and Mickey. 5 minutes, then we ride. Storm or no storm. As the door closed behind them, Frank was alone again with his shame and the growing certainty that the voice on the phone had been right about everything. The world was watching now, and Frank Morrison had given them exactly what they expected to see. Outside, thunder rolled across the California sky like the sound of his world ending. Frank stood in the electric silence of his emptied bar, the weight of 5 minutes feeling like a lifetime. He moved toward his office in the back, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar darkness. If this was the end, he needed to secure what mattered: the books, the cash reserves, the deed to the building. Whatever came next, Sandra would need something to fall back on. The office door stuck like always, and Frank had to shoulder it open. The small room smelled of old cigarettes and motor oil, dominated by a scarred wooden desk that had seen better decades. He was reaching for the bottom drawer when he noticed something wrong. The desk lamp was on. Frank always turned it off when he left. Always. A manila folder sat in the center of the desk blotter, thick and official-looking. Frank's name was written across the tab in precise handwriting he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he opened it, expecting legal papers or federal documents, something to make this night even worse than it already was. Instead, he found photographs. The first one stopped his breath entirely. It was him, 20 years younger, standing in the parking lot of this very bar. But the bar looked different, newer paint, different signs. Frank's hair was darker, his face unlined, and he was shaking hands with a black man in a business suit. Both men were smiling. Frank stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. He had no memory of this moment, none at all. He flipped to the next photo. Same parking lot, different angle. This time he could see the black man's face clearly, and Frank's blood turned to ice water. The features were familiar, the strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the bearing of a man accustomed to respect. Not Muhammad Ali, but someone who looked remarkably similar. Someone older, wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself like money and education had been his birthright. The third photograph made Frank's legs give out. He collapsed into his desk chair, staring at an image that rewrote everything he thought he knew about tonight. It was the tourist with the camera. Except in this photo, he was just a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing between the black businessman and a woman who shared his features. A family photo, taken right here in Frank's parking lot 20 years ago. With trembling fingers, Frank flipped the photograph over. Someone had written on the back in the same precise handwriting, Dr. Marcus Caldwell, his wife Eleanor, and their son David. 1954. Morrison's Roadhouse grand opening celebration. The room tilted around Frank like he was drunk, but he hadn't touched alcohol since that last desperate swallow at the bar. David Caldwell. The filmmaker who'd called wasn't some opportunistic stranger selling footage to the news. He was the kid in this photograph, the son of a man Frank had apparently met 20 years ago and completely forgotten. But that was impossible. Frank remembered the bar's opening night in perfect detail, the celebration, the speeches, the first angels to show up and claim the place as their territory. There had been no black businessman, no family photos. Frank would have remembered, wouldn't he? He flipped to the next photograph and nearly vomited. It was from Tonight Crystal, clear shots of Muhammad Ali standing at the bar, dignity intact despite Frank's aggression. But these weren't taken by the tourist. The angle was wrong, the quality too professional. Someone else had been there, someone with better equipment and a clear view of everything. The final photograph in the folder made Frank's world collapse entirely. It was him, shaking hands with Muhammad Ali. Not from tonight, not from any night Frank could remember. Ali looked younger, but not by much. This was recent, maybe a few years old. And Frank was smiling. Actually smiling, like he was honored to meet the man. like they were friends. Frank flipped the photo over. The handwriting was his own, though he had no memory of writing the words, "Thanks for keeping your promise, champ." The kid deserved better than his old man gave him. F. Morrison, 1971. The office door creaked open behind him. "Hello, Frank." Frank spun around, and his heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was the black businessman from the 1954 photograph, older now but unmistakable. Expensive suit, kind eyes, the bearing of a man who'd spent decades earning respect the hard way. "Dr. Caldwell," Frank whispered, though he still had no conscious memory of ever meeting the man. "You remember now?" Dr. Caldwell stepped into the small office, and Frank noticed he moved with the careful gait of someone recovering from illness. "Or are you still telling yourself you never saw me before tonight?" The photographs scattered from Frank's numb fingers. 20 years of buried memories crashing back like a dam breaking. The grand opening. The promise he'd made. The night 3 years later when Ali had come here on a personal favor, and Frank had treated him like royalty. The accident that had stolen it all away. "You were in a coma for 6 weeks, Dr. Caldwell said gently. Brain trauma. When you woke up, chunks of your memory were gone. Sandra thought it might be a blessing. You'd forgotten the worst parts too." His voice carried infinite sadness. "But you'd also forgotten all the good parts, all the progress you'd made." Frank's mind reeled as fragments of truth cut through the lies he'd been living. The voice on the phone. "My son David doing what you taught him, protecting family." Dr. Caldwell smiled sadly. "You see, Frank, you weren't the monster tonight. You haven't been the monster for 20 years. You were just a scared, broken man who couldn't remember why he'd tried to be better." Outside, thunder rolled again, but this time it sounded like the beginning of something instead of the end. Frank stared at Dr. Caldwell, fragments of buried memories surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. The accident, motorcycle versus semi-truck on Highway 99, 3 days after Christmas 1954. 6 weeks in Bakersfield General. Sandra holding his hand while doctors spoke in hushed tones about traumatic brain injury and selective amnesia. "The promise," Frank whispered, the words tasting like copper pennies. "I promised to help David get into medical school." Dr. Caldwell nodded slowly. "You did more than that. You changed, Frank. After you met my family, after you saw what your casual hatred was teaching the younger members, you started making different choices." He moved carefully to the single chair facing Frank's desk. "It took 3 years, but you transformed this place from a whites-only establishment into neutral ground. You made enemies doing it." The photographs on the floor suddenly made terrible sense. Frank bent to retrieve them with shaking hands, each image a window into a past he'd lost. There he was, standing up to Snake in the main bar, defending a black couple's right to drink there. There he was again, presenting a scholarship check to David Caldwell at his high school graduation. And the one that broke his heart, Sandra, young and proud, pinning a small American flag to his colors while Dr. Caldwell's family applauded. "Sandra knew," Frank said, "not a question. She watched you forget everything good about yourself and remember only the worst." Dr. Caldwell's voice carried 20 years of witnessed pain. "When you woke up from the coma, you'd reverted to the man you'd been before we met. The growth, the compassion, the courage it had taken to change, all gone. She tried to tell you, but you wouldn't believe her. Said she was trying to rewrite history to make you look soft." Frank's chest felt crushed under the weight of revelation. So she left. She left because watching you become the monster again was killing her. And because every time she looked at you, she saw the man you'd been, the one who'd cried when Ali hugged David at that scholarship ceremony, who'd stood up to the Oakland Charter when they demanded you reverse your integration policies. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward. "She never stopped loving that man, Frank. She just couldn't find him anymore." Through the office's single window, Frank could see Tommy and the others waiting by their bikes, steam rising from their rain-soaked leathers. The ride to Oakland loomed like a death sentence, but now Frank understood it was something else entirely, a chance to choose who he wanted to be when all the pretenses were stripped away. Tonight, when Ali walked in, Frank's voice cracked. "I treated him like the old Frank would have. The Frank who joined the angels to belong to something bigger than his own fear." Dr. Caldwell pulled a small tape recorder from his jacket pocket. David recorded everything through a wireless microphone he wore. Would you like to hear how it really ended? Frank nodded, though part of him dreaded what was coming. Dr. Caldwell pressed play, and the bar's acoustics filled the small office. Frank heard his own voice, ugly with prejudice and alcohol, making demands. Ali's responses, measured and dignified, the crowd's encouragement of Frank's behavior. But then something Frank didn't remember, his own voice again, much quieter. Jesus Christ, what am I doing? You're Muhammad Ali. Just a man trying to enjoy a quiet drink, friend. Shit. I'm sorry. This isn't... I used to be better than this. The recording continued, capturing a conversation Frank had completely blocked out. His stammered apologies, Ali's gracious responses, the crowd's gradual shift from bloodlust to uncomfortable silence as their leader's shame became impossible to ignore. It ended with Ali's voice, warm and forgiving. We all got battles with who we used to be, brother. The measure of a man ain't his mistakes. It's what he does after he makes them. Dr. Caldwell clicked off the recorder. David wasn't there to expose you, Frank. He was there because his father is dying, and he wanted to see if the man who'd changed our family's life was still in there somewhere. His eyes glistened. After hearing that recording, we know he is. Outside, a horn honked twice, Tommy's signal that time was up. Frank looked at the photographs scattered across his desk, evidence of a man he'd been and forgotten, then at Dr. Caldwell, who'd kept faith for 20 years that man might return. What happens now? Frank asked. Dr. Caldwell stood slowly, his illness evident in every careful movement. Now you decide whether to ride to Oakland as the man you've been hiding behind, or as the man you really are. He paused at the door. Either way, David will be at the press conference tomorrow morning. The question is whether he'll be defending you or mourning you. The door closed with a gentle click, leaving Frank alone with his fractured memories and one impossible choice. Chapter 8, Climax. Frank sat in the silence of his office, staring at the photographs scattered across his desk, like tarot cards revealing a future he'd forgotten he'd already lived. The tape recorder sat silent beside them, having delivered 20 years of buried truth in 5 devastating minutes. Outside, Tommy's motorcycle rumbled impatiently, the sound mixing with thunder to create a symphony of reckoning. The door chimed again, and Frank looked up expecting Dr. Caldwell's return. Instead, Sandra stepped through the rain-soaked entrance, her graying hair plastered to her head, her eyes carrying the weight of 2 decades' worth of unshed tears. I saw the cars outside, she said quietly. Marcus called me. Frank rose from his chair like a man approaching the gallows. Sandy, I know what you're thinking. She moved closer, and Frank could see she'd been crying. That I lied to you all these years, that the first let you believe you were something you weren't. Her voice broke. But Frank, how do you tell a man he's forgotten the best parts of himself? How do you make someone remember love when all they can recall is hate? The weight of 20 lost years pressed down on Frank's shoulders. He looked at a photograph of himself presenting that scholarship check to young David Caldwell, seeing a stranger wearing his face, a stranger with kind eyes and genuine pride. I destroyed us, he whispered. You got hurt. Sandra's hand touched his cheek, the first gentle contact they'd shared in decades. The doctors said the trauma might cause selective amnesia, but we hoped you'd remember eventually. Instead, you just got angrier when we tried to tell you who you'd become. Through the window, Frank saw Tommy walking toward the bar, his patience finally exhausted. In 5 minutes, Frank would have to choose between riding to Oakland as the broken man he'd believed himself to be, or standing here as someone he couldn't remember being. The press conference tomorrow, Frank said. David's going to tell the truth. Sandra's voice carried a strength Frank had forgotten she possessed. That Muhammad Ali came here 20 years ago as a favor to a friend, that you treated him like royalty, that you changed this place and yourself because you met a family who showed you what courage actually looked like. Frank stared at her, seeing not the bitter woman who'd left him, but the proud wife who'd watched him grow beyond his limitations. And tonight? Tonight you remembered why you hated yourself, but you forgot why you'd learned to love yourself too. She picked up the photograph of Frank and Ali shaking hands in 1971. This is who you really are, Frank. The man who made mistakes and spent years making amends. The man who turned a roadhouse full of hatred into neutral ground where everyone was welcome. The office door opened again, and David Caldwell stepped inside. No longer the mysterious filmmaker, but simply a middle-aged man whose childhood had been shaped by Frank's forgotten kindness. Behind him stood Tommy, water dripping from his colors, his face grim with the weight of unwelcome duty. "Time to go, Frank," Tommy said. "Sonny's waiting." Frank looked around the small office, at the photographs proving he'd been better than he remembered, at Sandra's tear-streaked face, at David Caldwell holding a camera that had captured not his destruction but his humanity. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. "Tell Sonny the meeting's canceled," Frank said quietly. Tommy's eyes widened. "Frank, you can't just—" "I'm resigning from the club." The words came out steady, final. Frank reached behind his neck and began working loose the patches that had defined him for 15 years, effective immediately. "Jesus Christ." Tommy stepped backward as Frank's colors hit the desk with a soft thud. "They'll never let you just walk away, not after tonight." "They will if they understand what really happened." David Caldwell held up a thick folder. "My father spent 20 years documenting Frank's transformation. Letters from families he helped, photographs from integrated events, testimony from civil rights leaders who considered him an ally." His voice carried quiet authority. "Tomorrow's press conference isn't about exposing Frank Morrison the racist. It's about celebrating Frank Morrison, the man who chose to change." Frank felt something breaking open in his chest. Not his heart, but the walls he'd built around it. 20 years of manufactured hatred crumbling away, revealing the man Sandra had loved and Dr. Caldwell had believed in. "I don't remember being him," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. Sandra took his hands in hers. "Then let us help you remember." Outside, the storm was breaking, thunder giving way to the gentler sound of healing rain. Frank looked at his discarded colors, then at the people who'd never stopped believing in the man he'd forgotten he could be. For the first time in 20 years, Frank Morrison smiled without anger and began the long journey back to himself. The morning sun cut through the dissipating storm clouds like forgiveness made visible, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot of Morrison's Roadhouse. Frank stood at the same spot where that first photograph had been taken in 1954, watching David Caldwell pack his equipment into a rental car with California plates. The press conference had lasted 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Sandra emerged from the bar carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cool air like prayers answered. Her movements were careful, as if she were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. 20 years of distance didn't disappear overnight, but something had shifted in the gravity between them. "How do you feel?" she asked, offering him the cup. Frank considered the question while sipping coffee that tasted like mourning instead of regret, like "I've been sleepwalking and just woke up." He paused, watching David secure the last of his camera cases, terrified that I'll forget again. "The doctor said the memories should stay now that they've been triggered." Sandra's voice carried the careful hope of someone who'd been disappointed before. "But even if they fade, you've got proof of who you became. That folder David gave you, it's all there." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the young filmmaker who'd risked his father's final months to save a man he barely remembered from childhood. David approached them with the measured gait of someone carrying heavy emotional cargo. "The footage will air next week," he said, shaking Frank's hand with genuine warmth. "Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up piece about reconciliation and second chances." He glanced between Frank and Sandra. "They'd like to interview you both if you're willing." Frank felt Sandra's questioning look, but the answer came easily. "We'll be ready." David smiled, and Frank saw his father's kindness reflected in the younger man's eyes. "He's proud of you, Frank. Despite everything, despite how hard it's been watching you forget yourself, he never stopped believing you'd find your way back." After David's car disappeared down the highway toward Bakersfield General, where Dr. Caldwell was beginning his final battle, Frank and Sandra walked the perimeter of the property like pilgrims visiting a shrine. The roadhouse looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, more like a regular bar and less like the fortress of isolation Frank had made it. "What happens now?" Sandra asked as they completed their circuit. Frank considered this, studying the building that had housed his penance for 2 decades. I've been thinking about that all morning. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, called my lawyer at dawn. I want to deed the property to a foundation, something that provides scholarships for kids like David. Sandra stopped walking. Frank, this place is your livelihood, your home. It was my prison, he corrected gently. And maybe my monastery too, but I'm ready to leave it. He looked at her, seeing the woman who'd loved him enough to walk away rather than watch him destroy himself. The question is whether you'd be willing to start over somewhere new, together. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure could bear their weight. Sandra touched the scar on Frank's temple where the accident had stolen his better self, her fingers tracing the line between who he'd been and who he'd become. We're not the same people we were, she said finally. No, Frank agreed. We're older, more careful with hope, but maybe that's not entirely bad. A pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, breaking their reverie. Tommy climbed out wearing civilian clothes instead of his colors, his face carrying the weight of difficult conversations. He approached them with the careful respect due to a former brother who'd chosen exile over allegiance. Sonny wants you to know the resignation's been accepted, he said formally. No retribution. The club considers your debt paid in full. He paused, studying Frank's face. For what it's worth, some of us always wondered why you changed so much after the accident. Makes sense now. Frank extended his hand. Take care of yourself, Tommy. They shook hands like old soldiers who'd survived different wars. Then Tommy climbed back into his truck and disappeared down the highway, carrying word of Frank's liberation back to a brotherhood that had claimed his soul but never truly owned it. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Frank found himself behind the bar one final time, polishing glasses out of habit while Sandra inventoried the bottles. The routine felt both familiar and foreign, like returning to a childhood home that had somehow become smaller. I keep thinking about what Ali said on that recording, Frank said suddenly, about the measure of a man being what he does after his mistakes. Sandra looked up from her clipboard. And what are you going to do, Frank Morrison? Frank set down the glass and really looked at her not through the lens of 20 years accumulated disappointment, but with the clarity of a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. I'm going to remember, he said simply, and I'm going to forgive myself enough to be the man you fell in love with. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving the world washed clean and ready for whatever came next.